God eftermiddag ska ni alla vara och hjärtligt välkomna till denna kombinerade prisutdelning och estradföreläsning. Magnus Aron heter jag och är till vardags vd för Esprit. Till min hjälp här idag har jag då Joakim Appelqvist som är TF vice generaldirektör på Vinnova idag.
Hej.
Och we're going to now move over to English, given that some of the winners today don't speak that much Swedish, and it also shows how international our higher education has become, because all theses these days are written in English when they're on the master and bachelor level. So we're going to start now. So welcome to this prize ceremony of the student thesis competition Nytt och Nyttigt. It's organized by Esprit and Vinnova, and this is the 8th consecutive time that we're giving out this award. And the purpose with the competition is to encourage students at our universities all around Sweden to write about innovation, commercialization, and utilization of new knowledge. And it's open for any faculty, regardless of what you're studying, and it has to be on the bachelor and master level. And this year we had 65 contributions to the competition, so the jury had a really hard time in selecting the winners. And the result you can see here behind me today here on the stage. And as I said earlier, the awards will be handed out by Joakim Appelqvist, who's the acting deputy director general at Vinnova. And what do these students then get, or former students I must say, get? We have 3 travel grants. The winners, they will get 30,000 Swedish crowns. The second prize winner will get 20,000, and the third will get 15,000 Swedish crowns. And now I want to say welcome to the author of these theses without any order. Piotr Bukansky, raise your hand so people can see who you are. Filippa Ingner, Tiago Enes, Anna-Lotta Forsman, and Lina Trosvik. Very welcome. So congratulations being the 3 best theses in this area the last academic year, the academic year 2016 and 17. So well done. But just to give us a little teaser on the main results, we want to have one question to you. So over to you, Joakim.
Thank you. Well, it's a rather simple one, and we start with Piotr and Tiago. What are the most important findings in your thesis?
I think to answer that, we first need to give you a bit of context on what we're actually doing. So we're trying to assess the impact of M&A on innovation. And it's important to understand our context there. We're looking mostly at large European listed corporations and how they carry out their innovation processes and how M&A actually impacts those processes. So we're looking at mostly bolt-on M&A deals. So rather small targets with seemingly complementary technologies, and we try to understand by looking at patent data whether this actually impacts the patent flows following the M&A event and actually improves the quality of innovation. So I pass to Piotr to maybe give some color on the results.
Very quickly, we found a positive impact of M&A on the quality of patents. So it's a complements R&D process. It's not innovation killer like some might say.
Sounds promising. Then we move over to Filippa and Lina. What would you like to say are the main findings in your paper?
The main purpose of our thesis was to examine the impact of local policy instruments on the adoption of electric vehicles in Swedish municipalities. So the main finding was that the local policy instruments in municipalities, such as improved charging infrastructure and public procurement of electric vehicles, do have a positive effect on the adoption of electric vehicles.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Anna-Lotta, what is the purpose of your paper, and what are the main findings?
So I studied partnerships within IoT innovation. So together with other organizations exploring and executing on IoT innovation. And one of the findings that I would like to highlight is the importance of understanding and analyzing the incentives and the payoffs for your partners in your collaboration and in your partnership. Because if there's an unbalanced partnership with the incentives and payoffs, that can affect the outcome and the performance of the partnership a lot.
Thank you very much. So now you know the content of the papers, and now is the moment that we've finally waiting for, the announcement of the winners. And this will be very exciting, at least for you, since you don't know what place you're in up until now. And we'll try not to do a rerun of the last Oscars, but trying to get it right this time. And we start with the second prize. And the second prize goes to Anna-Lotta Forsman for the thesis, Internet of Things, in Innovation Through Partnering. Big round of applause. And now for the third prize, and this goes to Piotr Bukansky and Tiago Enes for the thesis, The Impact of M&A on Innovation. Big round of applause. Then, last but certainly not least, the winner, first prize and travel grant of 300,000 Swedish crowns. 30. Or 30? Well, I didn't make it. Well, we haven't been that, we're not that cheap at Vinnova yet, so it will be 30,000. And I didn't manage to not slip it up. But it will go to Filippa Egner and Lina Trusvik for the thesis, Electrical Vehicle Adaptation in Sweden and the Impact of Local Policy Instrument. Big, big round of applause.
Yes, and a short photo. Super.
So, congratulations once again, and just give another big hand of applause because they deserve this. So when you leave the room after the open lecture, you will find a short summary of the three theses outside here. And also, they can also be found on the website for the competition, who is www.innovationsuppsats.se. And if you know any students that are writing their master or bachelor theses, please let them know about this opportunity to submit their work to this competition. And the deadline for submission this year is June 28th. So with that, thank you very much. And now over to Helene and the Estrad Open Lecture. That's also going to be very exciting. Thank you.
Okay, then it's time for Estrad. I want to say welcome to all of you, both here in the room and you who are watching on the web. I also want to say welcome to 5 of the authors to a new book about FinTech. They will soon present themselves, and we look forward to an interesting lecture. But first I want to say a few words about Esprit, the organization that arranged these lectures. My name is Helen Torgrimsson, and I work as a project manager at Esprit. We disseminate research-based knowledge in different ways. through these Estrad lectures and other events, through our website with web TV and a lot of articles of innovation, entrepreneurship, and SMEs, and also our magazine, Entré. I forgot to bring the 2 magazines we have here today, but in one of them you find an article with Robin, so grab one and read. The lecture will start very soon, and after about 45 minutes we will have a coffee break outside, and after the break we want you back here in about 15-20 minutes. There will be both more interesting facts and opportunities to ask questions. So with that, I leave the words to Robin.
Okay. Do you want to come in? Okay. Thank you. That's good. Okay. Thank you all. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is amazing to see so many people come. Who would have known not so long ago when we started with our book? I have our co-editors over here, Shahryar and Anthony. You'll be meeting them as well. Actually, for all who are all the other authors in the room? We have a big group who've been involved in the project. Some of you there standing up, so if you just take a look around. These are other people who you can speak with during the day to find out more about our book. So let's get started. How did all this start? Well, it actually started out a few years back when we received a grant from the Internet Infrastructure Foundation, or IIS, Internet Stiftelsen. And I was speaking with the CEO, trying to understand what should we be looking at. What is the role of the Internet, and how does the Internet influence innovation? And at the time, we said, really, there seems to be a lot of things happening within the financial sector. I was like, well, is there really? And this was a few years back. I said, but no, we really think that we should be looking into this. What is really happening? And that was really the beginning of this idea of this book. So what we're going to be talking about today is really this is our first launch of this book that was published by Routledge. We bought the open access license to this book. And that means that you can go to Amazon or to Routledge and download it for free. However, if you'd like the hard copy, you'll have to buy that. But the digital version is completely free. So please feel free, if you'd like that, just go and download it. So yeah, there was also the IS. I just want to mention the Marianne and Marcus Wallenberg Stiftelse, who's also indirectly financed a lot of this research. So just thank you to our sponsors, and thank you very much to Estrad and Estrad for giving us this opportunity to present our book. So where did we all come from? How did all this start? Well, I'm a professor of strategy, and people always want to put me into this digitalization box. But really what I'm interested in is trying to understand how so many of these new emerging technologies are really influencing value creation in society. What is changing? Are the way we're thinking about firms, the way we're thinking about governments, the way we're thinking about banks, etc., all our transactions, our interactions, are we seeing changes? And this is really one of the core drivers of my research, trying to understand how with this intersection between emerging technologies and social networks and the flows of resources through networks are influencing value creation in society. And I try to put this within a long-term perspective, looking back hundreds of years, and really challenging what we see as being our basic assumptions around value creation. And one of them is we think, yeah, of course we have banks, of course we have fiat currency or the crown, the US dollar, etc. Of course. But we haven't always had these institutions. And I think that's where it's, if one thing you can think about leaving the room today is think about what basic assumptions about the way we conduct our everyday transactions are really being challenged by these new emerging technologies. And I'd like to point down here, digital disruption has only just begun. I actually feel this because you're seeing an increasing not only pace of change, but the rate of the acceleration of the pace of the change of pace of change. And why is this? Where is this coming from? It's because so many different technologies converging with one another, enabling even more solutions and enabling this fast pace of change. So I see this as really the digital disruption has only just begun. When we think about digitalization with the financial services industry, we often think about making things more efficient. And if we look back to the year 2000, this is just one example where somebody looked at the Goldman Sachs, New York headquarters and looked at how many traders were on the floor and said, there was about 600 at the time. Today, there are only 2 left. This is clearly digitization in my world. We're taking tasks that we've already been doing and doing them a little bit better, maybe a little bit faster with the help of technology. But we have really changed the underlying transaction, the underlying value creation activity. I would say not really. This is really only about making things more efficient. This is about making things, just a little bit better, a little bit faster, a little bit cheaper. So putting that into perspective, there's a very famous professor from Stanford, James March, and he talks about this continuum, where you can go from exploitation, implementing technologies, making things a little bit faster, a little bit better, a little bit cheaper. But really what is interesting is thinking about this. How can we actually develop new value creation activities? And that's the hard thing, because so many of us get stuck in our everyday worlds. In fact, brain research shows that the piece of the brain that looks forward and thinks about the future is the same part of the brain where we have our memories. And so therefore, it's hard for us to break out of this, exploitation kind of frame of mind and think about doing things differently. So much of the reason for where this exploration comes from is basically, you could say, from tourists. If you think about a younger generation or someone coming in and challenging, why do we do things the way we do here? Can we do things potentially a little bit differently? If we were to start over, how could we do things completely differently and still satisfy the customer? What you're finding is so many of these new technologies that are being used is how can we actually enable the customer, the end user, to have a much better experience, starting with the customer. And we often tend to forget that. So I think what we're seeing within this whole area of FinTech is really just one more extension of what we've seen in so many other industries that maybe were happening a little bit prior. So if we keep talking about FinTech, so what is this definition? What is FinTech? Well, there are so many different definitions. And you could say, well, haven't we had FinTech for a long time? I mean, we've had new technologies always. What else? What is really new here? I think it does have a little bit to do with this aspect of exploration. So if we were to start over, how can we do things differently? But just for one definition is what we've been using within the book, and you'll see many things. It's about this innovative blending. It's about exploring, trying out new ways of using technologies to solve end-user needs. But it's basically, still enabling these functions that the primary banks have been doing. And this is also the interesting aspect. Do we need banks? How can we actually provide these services without necessarily going through traditional banks? Does anybody know when the Central Bank of Sweden was founded, by the way? Anybody know? 1668, 1668. It's not that long if you think about the whole span of human history, how long we've had the central bank. It isn't that long. But this is still, one area where we say, oh, of course, we've always had, we've had the crown or we've had the central bank, but we haven't. So I think what we're seeing in this wave of FinTech is challenging these assumptions. So this innovative blending to enable these services. It could be the whole range of service or just one service, but we're seeing how can we do this? And I'd like to stress the innovative way. This is actually the innovative way. Now, I said, we've been seeing FinTech, and really you could say we're very much in another wave of FinTech. In Stockholm, and I mentioned the central bank, Sweden, we've been leading this wave for a long time, I'd say. This we pulled out of our report that we did a few years back, which kind of set the scene for starting doing this book, where we looked at, what has Sweden been doing? And you can see we've done a lot of firsts along the way and have leading very, in a sense, using new technologies within the financial services area. You go way back. The first one, it's hard to read. 1959, the Bankgiro was founded, the world's first ATM, etc. So really, we're building on this, and I think this is where, if we think about innovation and starting, learning and how within the era of FinTech is building on what we already know as well. We have this history, this knowledge that we can build on. So today, in this new wave, if we say, what is FinTech all about? And it's really kind of this. It's these small. It started out with this, these small companies starting up, popping up, saying, hey, there's a need out there. There's a customer pain. It takes too long to make a payment. Why should it take so long? What could we not solve this in a different way if we were to start out? And picking, cherry picking one service or this service or that service. But the interesting thing is not being a bank. Just being, a startup company from without. And I think this is where we're seeing that this is, many aspects of these new companies coming along challenging. So this was very much kind of the first wave, the first part of the second wave. Well, then what have we been seeing? How do these traditional actors come in? What do? Do they just sit back and say, okay, you startup companies, go take our customers, press down our profits? Do we allow this? Do we not allow this? What do they see? And when all new technologies or new things come along, there tends to be this resistance. Yeah, whatever. They're not going to be around. They're fly by night, or nothing will happen. But then you see, as these smaller companies start gathering pace, the incumbents are the ones, the established actors, saying, oh, wow, things are happening here. What are they doing? And if you think about within the area of financial services, it's no wonder that large banks and established actors have had difficulty innovating. Think about where after the financial crisis, so much effort had gone into regulation and compliance, fulfilling new regulations, fulfilling this compliance. Do we have time and effort to actually put into new innovations? And I think this is also, if we think about what is the purpose of a firm, what is the purpose of these actors? Is it the innovation? Is it to allow others to innovate? Can we partner? And then we saw very much this second wave, right? The established actors saying, oh, this is actually growing. Maybe we could think about joining forces, collaboration. And I think that's something we're seeing a lot of now, very much thinking much more in terms of an ecosystem. I'm just not my firm, but how can I be a part of a larger ecosystem that it's enabling our customer group to fulfill their needs? So going beyond just being, say, a bank, but thinking, okay, working in collaboration with others, and seeing this then taking off. Now looking into the future, what might future of financial services look like? Well, Bill Gates said banking is essential, but banks are not. Do we need banks? That's how I started out. Challenging assumptions. Do we necessarily need to have banks? Perhaps, who is to say that other organizations out there, especially these large internet platforms, you think about Facebook or Airbnb or Google or some other one, could they not take over the role of a bank? Think about all the information they have. I bet Facebook could probably determine what kind of credit rating you have based upon your behavior on Facebook. And not only that, who is in your network? Because it's all about understanding the networks. So this is one aspect moving forward. What other new entrants into this industry will we see? But then again, we haven't even thought about what is happening in terms of the blockchain. How many of you, just out of curiosity, own a cryptocurrency? A few of you, quite a few. It's interesting, how long have we had cryptocurrencies? It isn't even 10 years. But yeah, we're looking now in the regulation, okay, the ICOs, the tokens that are coming along, how are we going to regulate these? Well, it's come so fast that it's hard for regulators to keep up with this. So moving forward, there's a lot of uncertainty in this area as well. What will happen as we move forward with the blockchain, with smart contracts, for example, with other types of currencies coming along? I think we're going to see even more of our basic assumptions around the way financial services are conducted will be even more challenged. And actually, we'll talk about in a little while, just mention it, that we're working on a new book looking at the future of welfare, the future of the government. Do we even need, say, nation states? Where will this whole aspect of financial transactions and FinTech, et cetera, take us? Talking about crypto governments, for example, crypto democracies. So many unknown questions. So I think the purpose of this book, that when we started this, was not to do yet another report looking at how many companies there are. For example, I believe in Stockholm there, where's Michal? Michal, how many FinTech companies are there in Stockholm now? Michal just did a large report.
It depends how we define it. It was 188 plus.
Yes, 188 plus. This is the hard thing. How do you define FinTech? Michal spent a lot of time trying to understand, how do we actually define FinTech? And it depends, again, what is for the definition, the number of companies. They say, well, does that matter, the exact number? Maybe it's about how are they challenging the assumptions? What's happening? So again, moving forward, this is one aspect we looked at, is trying to think, okay, if we go beyond just thinking about the numbers, but what really does this whole FinTech mean for financial services? So in the book, we actually divide it up into 4 sections because we look at institutional theory. If one wants to understand how an industry is potentially being transformed, institutional theory says, well, okay, what do you need to look at? You need to look at regulations. So what's happening in terms of the regulation sphere? How are they changing? Are they enabling? Or are they more of a force for stability? A force against change? What about cognition? Cognition, the way, the way we think about things, the way we trust, or legitimacy. What are our values? How are we thinking about, what's going on within the financial services, within this industry? Another one, and the third section has to do with norms. What's the way we do things around here? For example, when crowdfunding came along, our first study was looking at how do entrepreneurs thinking about crowdfunding. And say, oh, but the norm isn't to put out your project on some website and ask for people to donate money. No, it was about going to business angels or the bank or getting soft loans. So you saw a change, how are the norms changing? And then also you have to look at the actors, the external actors and the internal actors within an industry. So in the book, we actually looked at we broke the book down into 4 different sections where we looked at each of these: regulation, cognition, norms, and the actors. And today we'll be presenting a chapter out of 2 of these sections. We'll be looking at trust, because I think this is extremely, in fact, somebody says the trust gap is growing even more and more and more today. So we'll be looking at trust, and also digital traces, which is very relevant today if we think about just this recent backlash and techlash, for example, what's been going on with Cambridge Analytica, for example, on Facebook. What is happening with our data, the integrity, the privacy of data? So we'll be looking at these 2 aspects in much more in depth today. So with that, that's what I had to present. I believe we're going to move into the next session. Yes? With Mats. Mats here. Yes, Mats, please. Thank you.
Did I switch that on? Okay, that's on. Thank you very much, Robin. Let me put my paper here. I need some glasses. Thank you very much, Shahryar. So thank you for that introduction, Robin. And I think you did a splendid work explaining this very complex situation that we've been trying to deal with. It's really fascinating. And I must say that when I started to look at the topic of trust in this context, I was also fascinated because it's a very interesting aspect of everyday life. Now, trust is something that you probably all would agree is essential for specifically the industry, the financial industry, trusting our financial institutions, our financial companies, etc. And yet, it's very vaguely defined. If you ever thought about how is trust defined, actually? It's something that we use in our daily life, but mostly it's kind of a gut feeling. Oh, I trust this person or this institution, but how would you find it? And if you look at definitions, if you look them up, you're going to find things like this one. Firm belief in the reliability, truth, or ability of someone or something. So note the word belief, which is not very, strictly defined, I would say. Belief is very vague to me as well. And I don't like vague things. So I tried to look for another definition. And I started to look for different concepts, and I stopped at one that I thought looked interesting, which is about predictability. So, because one quote that I found interesting was this one: predictability built the trust that allowed people to synchronize their actions in mutually productive ways. So this is a kind of a fundamental for doing business. What is this? If you can predict what your partner or your customer or your business colleague will do, you will be able to decide to invest your efforts. You will invest in time. You will maybe invest in training or in buying materials or whatever, because you can trust that doing that you will be able to synchronize your actions with other people that have a predictive behavior. So this is essential for doing business, actually, to be able to predict what your other people in your industry are doing, or the people that you work with. So then I tried to come up with this definition that trust could be a possibility to predict a desirable, maybe, outcome from interactions with someone or something. It could be undesirable. I mean, you could build the trust that someone is not desirable for your for your business. That's also kind of trust. But normally we kind of tend to think about it in a positive way. So a possibility to predict a desirable outcome. And the first takeaway here, when talking about digitalization, digital technologies, is that digital technologies with big data, especially, and artificial intelligence with deep learning that we have been talking about so much in the last year, is very good at calculating predictions. So artificial intelligence with deep learning is very much used for optimization and prediction. Prediction of whatever, prediction of behavior, prediction of how your machinery is working, or prediction of the outcome for an effort in the market. Very much about prediction. And the second takeaway here is to understand, when you look back at what I started, that when you have something that is not very well defined, that you use in your ordinary life, it's probably possible subject to disruption within digitalization, because something that is not defined is something that you haven't analyzed the mechanisms that are in play. So suddenly you will find that digitalization, as with so much else in our society, will change the fundamental conditions for this concept, as trust, for example. And we will come back to that. But here, again, think about this. Digital technologies are good at predictability. And we're going to see how this can be used for building trust in new ways, which I think is part of what we see in the FinTech industry. It's a different kind of concept of how to build trust. So when I started out to do this, investigate this, I talked with 10 people in the FinTech industry and the financial industry to do interviews with them to understand how they looked upon trust, the concept of trust, and how they related to trust, to building trust specifically. And they came up with a number of particulars for building trust, which I will just summarize. And the first of them are markers. So markers is a way for a FinTech company to start maybe choosing famous people, important people, VIP people for the board or among the investors, or try to get media reports on your financial service or FinTech service, or maybe do some expert testing of third-party companies, an ISO certification, or a banking license, or using instruments such as the bank ID. So these are all markers. Note that they're not really relating to how much your financial service could objectively be trustworthy. It's more kind of giving people a sense of predictability, of trustworthiness. So they're just markers, but they're very useful for building trust. So the second one is social. Social, and now the interviewees that I talked to, they actually noted that they thought that the social networks and the friends of the users were maybe more important than the markers, in the sense that in a social network, in the peer-to-peer world that we have today, you know that bad news spread very quickly. So if you haven't heard anything negative about this service, it's probably okay, because if there would be a problem, with security or trustability of this service, someone among your friends would note that. And it would spread to 10 persons, who would then spread it to 10 persons, to 10 persons, and immediately, within a very short time frame, you would have a large problem. And internet companies know this. They're very careful about this, because they know that bad news spread very quickly. And as a user, you know the contrary. If I haven't heard any bad news, it's probably okay. Again, it's kind of a statistical, even though you don't calculate it, it's kind of a statistical feeling that if I haven't heard anything about this, probably I could predict that it's safe. And again, this is a typical sign of the change we see with digitalization and internet in all industries, that we go from an hierarchical structure to a peer-to-peer structure, which is basically, I would say, a major shift that few people know, because it's coming so slowly, but it's changing the way we organize things, organization. It's changing the ways we distribute news, you know, from hierarchical organizations with editors and everything to peer-to-peer spreading news, and we got all these problems with fake news, etc. So it's a typical digital shift that social networks, communications and social networks have a great importance. Next step is, another thing here to note about social is that millennials probably are particular in this in this case, because they, of course, they tend to spread and share information more freely than pre-internet people maybe would do. So they relate to information in the internet and to their friends' social networks in another way. As one of the interviewee put it, which I think is interesting, for the millennials, trusting online or mistrusting, as the case may be, or being wary, but in a different way than people who are pre-internet are wary. So it's worthy to note that millennials maybe relate to this kind of information on the internet in a different way, which might change the way we will build trust eventually. There are two kinds of trust. So first, you would say, just a moment, yeah. So you could say that in financial services you have the security aspect of trust, that you would consider your financial institution a secure institution for handling your funds. And the other one is if you could feel trust in that the financial institution is giving you good advice for how to manage your funds. Now the interviewees considered that banks, traditional banks, are still getting trust among their users for security, but maybe the users are feeling less and less that actually traditional bank institutions are having the second kind of trust, giving good advice, managing the funds in a good way. And this would be considered then for fintech companies as an opportunity to take that position. As the security is handled by the banks, they could handle the part where you could offer a good advice, you could offer better services, you could offer actually a trustworthy service of giving, managing the funds of the users. And you can note here again that maybe millennials would put more trust, as Robin pointed out, in the internet giants rather than with the traditional banks. So why not trust, for a young internet-connected person, why not trust Facebook or Apple or Google or Spotify for doing monetary transactions, maybe through messaging service, which has already been launched by Facebook and Apple and others. So this is a typical situation, again, where internet giants, by their extensive contact with the users, very effective contact with users, go into any industry and they steal the customer because their good contact, the trustworthiness that they have with the users is a very strong asset when launching a new service. So maybe we're going to see financial services being launched by these giants rather than by the banks. Trust is also two-way. So fintech companies don't only need to be trusted by their users, they also have to trust their users. Some part of this is, of course, regulation, know your customer regulation, for example. But for being able to doing business in the financial industry, you have, of course, to trust your user. And when doing that on the internet, it's kind of tricky because you don't meet persons. And here, the Swedish bank-owned system BankID for remotely identifying persons has been a door opener. And this was considered evident by all the interviewees, I would say. But, so this really changed the fintech industry in Sweden. But it also has been criticized because, firstly, because the BankID is owned by 7 large banks, and it could be considered a problem that these banks might have a self-interest not wanting to be challenged by other services in this industry. So they could, although I've been actually investigating this, you can read it in the book and talk with the responsible persons. But it could be considered as a problem, even though they say that they would never negate a possibility to use the BankID to another company. You could always have that suspicion. The second part of the criticism against BankID, which was launched in 2003 and the mobile BankID in 2011, the second criticism is that there might be lacking security, and I also investigated that in my chapter. Digital trust, then. As I mentioned in the beginning, with digital technologies, there might be a possibility of building analysis for prediction. And so you could build trust. With big data, with artificial intelligence, automated processes, not being dependent on personal judgment. And one example of this is a company called Hive Online, where I interviewed the CEO and the founder of this company, Sophie Blackstad, in my chapter. And so this is a company that tries to automate the creation of credit ratings, not based on a bank or an institution's valuation or a human valuation, but analyzing context, harvesting automatically data from interactions between parties, putting them through an algorithm and calculating a kind of a trust rating, a credit rating automatically. And that rating would have a higher quality, first of all, than a human judgment. It would be more fair. Because it would have a higher quality because it's based on much more data. It would be more fair because it's not dependent on human judgment or bias. And then you could store, the idea is to store this rating in a blockchain, which you might know by now is this distributed ledger which underlies Bitcoin. But basically, it's a system with distributed trust. So you don't have a trusted party owning the database. It's a distributed database, so it's difficult to tamper with, and no one can control it. So you will have that kind of spread out, this credit rating. And the consequences of such a system, for example, in developed countries, developed economies, would be a rebalance between large enterprises and small businesses. They would have more fair situation between the two. In developing economies, another situation could be evident that about 2 billion people in the world who are unbanked, and 1.5 billion of them without even a birth certificate, they will never get a traditional credit rating, never ever. But with such a system, they could actually get this automatically, and they could go to the bank and get a loan and start a business. So it would be a huge change for the opportunities to do business in developing economies. So that was, yeah, right. Then we've got a cultural aspect, which is not to be forgotten. There are two kinds of trust that could be defined, and from a different kind of human aspect. And the first one is cognitive trust, which is based on your perceptions of the capability or what people are doing professionally. So you would kind of decide with your cognitive aspect which kind of trust you would have in this person, in this institution. The other one is affective trust, which as opposed to cognitive trust is based on your emotional feelings for a person, being together, and if this person would be kind of a person you like and trustworthy. So, of course, two different parts. The interesting part of this scale between cognitive and affective trust is that it's distributed unevenly in the world. So if you look at a world map, you would find that cognitive trust is mainly predominantly existent in the US, in Canada, in Northern Europe, whereas and in Australia. Whereas affective trust is much more important in South America, in South of Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. You might say that affective trust might be more important in countries where the legal system is not working very well, so you have to, because then you don't know if you can sue a person or a company or not, so you have to rely on people in another way. That might be one explanation, but it's noteworthy just to understand that there is a difference. For example, in US, US companies rely very much on agreements, written agreements, because it's a way to do business with people that you otherwise might not trust. So it's an instrument. And it's considered very unprofessional to mix cognitive and affective trust in the US. But on the other hand, when a US businessman comes to China and tries to, make a deal based on facts of what this company has achieved, etc., he will never get, or she will never get this deal done until there has been a time of social networking, social being together, building affective trust. So this is one of the first things you need to understand doing business internationally. But it could even be considered as offensive to propose a written agreement in such a country. That would be like, you don't trust me. And end of the agreement. Right? And my main point here is that, if we now start to think about global systems for digital trust, so here is a cultural aspect, a human aspect that must not be forgotten. If you create a global system that you think will work everywhere, you of course have to put it into the context of people feeling or relating to trust in different ways from human conditions, which is not maybe always integrated in the algorithms. And the algorithms might be biased from this aspect too. Then the trust net is more of a kind of a future perspective. If you would think about today, now when it comes to trust, one part of that had made people uneasy is the discussions on oh, the word disappeared from me. Controlling people. What do you say? Not controlling. The NSA scandal, right? Surveillance, right. That was the word I was missing. And the problem with surveillance could be defined in one way. So why are we worried about surveillance? If you think about a small village, everyone knows everything about everyone. This is symmetric. So the problem with surveillance today is the asymmetry. That the people who are watching you are people that you don't know who they are. It's kind of asymmetric compared to the small village. And one suggestion for how you could deal with this would be to create a new part of the internet where everyone who's acting there has to be identified. Let's say that they had to be identified with a system which is not even centralized, but based on a blockchain, a kind of a distributed identification system, hard identification. That means that everyone acting on this part of the internet would be visible and identified, even the person who wants to watch you. So even governments would need to be identified. Then you would obtain this kind of symmetry, and people could then choose with their feet, so to speak, to go to this part of the internet for doing certain activities. They could choose to be in the trust net for being visible and identified, or being on the internet to be visible but anonymous, or being in what they call the dark net, where you are invisible and anonymous. You can go between these three parties, these sections of the internet. It's kind of a vision of a global system of identification as well, which again might be possible because specifically of the possibility with digital technologies to create, to calculate prediction, and in this way identify and building trust in the long run. So as a conclusion then, let's see, 4 things. Trust might be related to predictability. And the character of trust is changing, like so much else in society, with digitalization, with internet. And at the same time, you discover that you can build trust in new ways. So that's the second one. You can build trust in new ways with digital technologies. The third conclusion is that digital technologies can be used to build decentralized systems for dealing with trust. Global decentralized systems. And then you, of course, as a fourth conclusion, you have to remember the human and cultural aspect. If you build a global system, that not everyone is equal in all over the world in their relation to trust. And also I would say that if we can offer new ways to build trust with digital technologies, do we take away something of the human aspect of building trust in between persons? Or are we adding something just? So is it a richer way of building trust, or is it a different way, and how would that then change our possibilities of doing business and relating to each other? Questions, but very interesting questions. I think since this is so central to not only to financial business, but also to our everyday life, trust, it's interesting to think about how digital technologies and digitalization will change the way we build trust between each other. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's take a coffee break. Coffee is served outside, and we want you back here latest 4:10. See you then.
1, 2, 1. Ah, perfect. Good afternoon. Hi. I hope you've all had a good fika break and you're loaded up for the last little bit. My name's Ingram Bogusz. I have recently defended my PhD here at Handelshögskolan. A little short bit of advertising. I'll be teaching a course on FinTech entrepreneurship in the fall at the Stockholm School of Entrepreneurship. So if any of you are interested in looking a little bit at the academic perspective on FinTech, that will be held a little bit later in the year. So my chapter in this book was specifically about the use of digital trace data and data online for the development of FinTech services. And very much what is the case is that data has come to be seen as the most valuable thing that a firm can have. So this is, move it out, there? Okay, better. Yeah, okay, good. As the most valuable thing a firm can have. So if you take the example of Tesla, who are not in FinTech, the more data they gather, the more their cars drive, the more valuable they become as a firm. So there's a kind of paradox there. The more work they do, the more valuable they become. There's no seeming limit on how much data they can gather. There's no seeming limit on how much they can do. It just keeps increasing their value and increasing their value. And the reason for that is essentially the more data you have, the more insight you can generate, the more patterns can be described, the more insights between user groups and within user groups you can look at. And the prevailing wisdom seems to be that data is in and of itself only a good thing and doesn't come with any kinds of pitfalls. And although there is some merit to that, there are certainly a lot of opportunities involved in data generation and business models based upon data. Perhaps there is room for a note of caution and room for diving deep into a note of caution and a little bit of discussion of what it is that is actually happening with our data. So typically what we talk about when we're talking about digital traces in FinTech is how the collection of these data has led to an improvement in existing services, the creation of new services, and access or creation to new markets. And I think Mats, where did he go? Oh, there he is, spoke quite coherently on these 3 points. But what I'd also like to flag is that the volumes of data in and of themselves create problems. On the one hand, they create problems just handling large volumes of data from a business perspective. On the other hand, more and more individuals and even companies are becoming concerned about what it is that is being collected about them and how it is that those data are being used. And lastly, there is this presumption that when we automate things, somehow bias is eliminated. And I think Mats highlighted that. And one of the concerns that I have is that algorithms and analytics, by their very nature, are built by humans, and consequently exhibit some of the same biases as humans, A, and B, possibly even the hiding of these biases behind algorithms means that we can't even see biases when they're there. And that concerns me. So if we look, for instance, at some of the areas in which we've seen a whole lot of FinTech development, it spans more or less the length and breadth of what it is that traditional financial services do. Everything from credit scoring and lending, which we've discussed about today already, to fraud detection, to personal finance, which allow people to automate or encourage certain patterns in individual level behaviors, to asset management and recommendations that are generated by virtue of algorithms rather than individuals. And lastly, by trying to limit risk. And this is very much linked back to your fraud detection. So these are just a description and some examples of firms that use these kinds of things. And they do good work. My concerns about data don't mean that I think that any of these firms are doing anything intrinsically dodgy. In fact, on the contrary, I've chosen the nice ones here. Some of the dodgy ones are not on this slide. But this is, I guess, just for reference to see some examples in case you're curious and want to go off and look, and also to give you some descriptions of what it is that's happening here. What is very clear is that if one sort of looks under the hood, it's all automated. It's machine learning, it's artificial intelligence, and on the one hand, that creates much more effective services, but it makes it very difficult for us to scrutinize what it is that these algorithms are doing. So my favorite example is of Wonga.com in the UK, who are a payday lender. Do any of you know about how they do risk assessment, credit scoring? Anybody? Okay, Michal, you don't count. Okay, so this is their old website. They've since updated it, and I have, don't have any reason to believe that they've changed their methodology in updating their website. But what happens is you go onto their website and you are presumably looking for a short-term loan, because otherwise you wouldn't be there. And you land on the platform and you're immediately presented with some possibilities. The one is a kind of benchmark amount, and the other is a benchmark time. And as you land on that website, they immediately know things about you. They know what, or maybe let's give you these quotes a little bit later. They immediately know what device it is that you're landing from. So if you land on this website and you are on the latest Apple iPad, this little bar over here will go all the way up to 260. So the default amount that it's offering you, because you're on a premium device, is higher. It'll also observe your behavior based on what it is that you do as you interact with the site. So if I come onto the site and let's say I'm not on a premium device, I'm just on an Android device, and I immediately take this little thing and pull it all the way to the top, alarm bells start going. They immediately can tell by my behavior, which is translated into digital traces, that maybe I'm in a financially dodgy situation. The fact that I need a lot of money, I don't actually know how far this plus goes, a good long way, that I immediately need a lot of money, and that I don't qualify for other kinds of credit, so I don't have a credit card or I couldn't get the money from a bank, otherwise I wouldn't be here. Similarly, if I were to take the amount of time and max it out, that would also send off alarm bells. And we don't think about these things. We don't think about the fact that on the back end, websites identify what devices we're coming from. The fact that if I were to go to Wonga from my phone versus my iPad, I do have an iPad, versus my laptop, the fact that the physical presentation on those different devices is different means that they're collecting that data on the back end. And there's no reason why they shouldn't use that data or shouldn't be able to use that data for something more specific and more business appropriate than just optimizing the appearance of their website for me or for you. So just a little, this is a quote from a study done on Wonga. So this is the thing about the 111, and if I'm on a premium device, it goes up to 265. Different browsers, different devices, and in fact, what seems to be the case based on this research is that they don't have a benchmark and they uprate you. It's that they have a benchmark and they downrate you. So by implication, what it is that they're saying is you can only go downwards, right? The more data they gather about you, the worse your credit score is one interpretation, to be sure. And so this is another description, just as I described, of moving the slider all the way up on both sliders. And so immediately in interacting with this, what I start thinking is, how do they control for other kinds of externalities? Typically, and particularly when it comes to credit rating in developing worlds, the people who are most in need of credit short term are young people, are people in desperate situations. So maybe they've had illness in the family, maybe they're busy going through a divorce. There's a whole lot of context that goes into the decisions that we make to obtain credit. It is also still true that it is easier to get payday loans, or here in Sweden for us, SMS loans, than it is to get loans at banks. And by easy, I mean quicker and more convenient, because this is done so quickly online, whereas a bank, you have to go to the physical bank, you have to negotiate, you have to give bits of paper. So on the one hand, the data that allows the service being offered to be quick and convenient actually targets people who are at structural disadvantages and actually need money quickly and easily. And that's very problematic. That makes us, or at least makes me, a little bit uncomfortable in the pit of my stomach. Moreover, the fact that they're saying that people who have iPads are somehow premium customers, they're clearly creating structures within their algorithms that lump people into groups without distinguishing and without placing that data into context. And in the pit of my stomach, I go, oh, this is so frustrating. But on the other hand, the data doesn't lie. The fact that they have lumped people or put people into certain classifications based on their interactions with the sliders and the device with which they access the website clearly has merit, clearly warrants doing, because they're still doing it, and there's profit to be made on doing so. And so this presents a little bit of a tricky dilemma, because on the one hand, the data say one thing, and on the other hand, we have these moral difficulties and perhaps some sort of need of context that we would like that from a social level that financial services providers take into account. A footnote, perhaps, is that Wonga, for this very reason, have got into trouble from financial authorities in the UK and have been forced to try and explain why their automated decision-making makes some of the decisions in the way that it does. But I want to highlight that it's not all bad. There is a lot of really good. And so this is Dreams, is anyone from Dreams here? Who are a Swedish actor who make use not so much of the behaviors that we do online, but our financial behaviors, so the purchase of small amounts, or purchases using small amounts in order to trigger certain savings. So for instance, you can use the Dream app to every time you decide not to have your coffee at Espresso House, so let's say you normally have coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it goes to 10:30 and you haven't had your coffee, Dreams will then draw the cost of that coffee and put it into a savings account for you. So the idea behind this is that they encourage you to engage in financially responsible behavior, like maybe having coffee at home more often or having lunch at home more often. And by doing that, helping you to save towards what is essentially your dream. So some goal that you yourself put up and that it helps you obtain. So there's a lot of positive here, but it depends very much firstly on how it's structured, but also on the transparency of the services that are involved. So this is very transparent. You go in, you say, under these circumstances, I would like this money to be saved. These are the triggers. This is my control over the algorithm. And then the algorithm goes and does it automatically for you. In this situation, there's very little transparency. People who go onto the site don't know what it is that's being collected or why, and consequently, unwittingly end up in this situation that maybe feels a bit uncomfortable to most of us. But these are examples that come very much from the developed world, so the UK here and then Sweden. But as Matt's also highlighted, financial services are often severely lacking in the developing world. And this has enormous potential. This could be something that provides bank accounts for millions, that allows people to conduct transactions over their mobile phones, which is a lifesaver because they live out in rural areas and can't get to the big cities where all the banks are established. There are all sorts of wonderful positive opportunities. But given the volume of the data that's being collected, and given some of the pitfalls, for instance, bias being hard-coded, for instance, correlation and causation being confused, there is some concern, and rightly so, that these new financial services that are being built based on digital trace data perhaps are not being built on the same kind of firm financial footing as some of the financial services and financial oversight that we enjoy in the developed world. So that's just a little side note. What I think is very interesting when we talk about data is that we tend to talk about it as this monolithic data. And academics and all sorts of other individuals have made attempts to try and understand what it is and to classify what it is that is being collected, and implications in terms of who controls what it is that is being collected. And I've summarized in this little table, and there's a larger discussion in the book if you go in and read there, what some of these data are and what the classifications are that we are actually looking at. So the first is that we make a distinction between data with content and metadata. So data with content being data that says something very specific. My name is Claire, I live just outside Stockholm, this is my address, this is my phone number, this is my annual income. Very clear. And some of that is data that we are, in a financial context, used to disclosing, which primarily is your plain service data. But there is also other data with content that we deliberately leave out there, but often don't always retain control of. And that is disclosed data and entrusted data. And so both of those are kinds of data that we put out into the world, and we do leave them deliberately, but we don't think about who controls and who has rights over those data. So the typical example is the stuff that we leave out on social media. In China, for example, I've gone and forgotten the name of the firm, but there is a FinTech firm that has been building credit scores based on publicly available Facebook data. Oh, sorry, not Facebook data, of course, social media data. And the recent Cambridge Analytica scandal, if some of you have kept abreast of that, has demonstrated how incredibly easy it actually is for third parties to get hold of social media data. So although we disclose our data to Facebook, we entrust that LinkedIn or Google will do right by us as we share our data with them. There are two problems. The one is that they have a profit motive to sell on that data, to bundle it on for other kinds of services. And the other is that the controls that they have in place are not perfect and perhaps do not protect us adequately. So although they are deliberately left, we don't retain control of them. Some of this data with content that is left and that we don't necessarily control is incidental to the stuff that we leave deliberately. So for instance, staying within data with content, when your friends tag photographs of you, or tag you in a tweet, or tag you on a LinkedIn post. This is incidental data. And that also says something about you, right? It says a whole lot about what it is that your interests are. Maybe if the person has posted a tweet that has a location, the fact that you're tagged on it as well means that your location can be identified. Lots of information about us as individuals is put out there by our friends and family without us even consenting, which becomes problematic given that it isn't in our control and can be collected and distributed. And typically regulations around data deal with this data with content, because the idea is that personal integrity relies on us being identified or not identified based on this data, right? And the presumption is that only data with content can be used to identify and or discriminate us against us as individuals. And metadata, which is data about data, hasn't been subject to the same kind of scrutiny. And so when I talk about metadata, what I'm talking about is descriptions of the data. So for instance, if I disclose a photograph to Facebook, although the photograph itself is disclosed data, metadata, for instance, the time that I put it up, if there's some sort of location tag, this is all metadata about my data. And on its own, it doesn't identify me. If you have, an empty vacuum where you can't actually see my photograph and you don't know that it's me, and all that you can see is some photograph with a time and a place stamp, on its own, it doesn't mean anything. But as you aggregate it and as you start to collect every photograph that I've ever put up, every timestamp, every location, if you're someone who shares a lot of data, what then happens is you can track someone's movements, so geographically see where they are. Facebook is perhaps a bad example. Metadata about our credit card transactions is incredibly informative. If we think about ourselves here in Sweden, where basically we don't use cash anymore, at least I don't. Every time I swipe my card, Visa or MasterCard, depending on which card it is that I use, knows where I am and what it is that I'm spending. And based on that data, they could see my movement patterns and potentially could identify me based on those movement patterns, but also can identify my spending habits. Maybe I have an expensive weakness for, I don't know. Last time I gave this presentation, I did it with my 6-month-old baby on my arm. So maybe I have an expensive taste for baby clothes or baby pacifiers. And this data, is all unintentionally left, but aggregated, and the volume of it allows companies to infer quite a lot about us, both in terms of our patterns, but ultimately, if they have enough of us, can start identifying us as individuals. So the fact that regulation, or pre-existing regulation, GDPR goes a little bit further, but by and large, regulation doesn't deal with metadata sufficiently, becomes problematic when we look at the scale of the data that we're collecting. So what are the implications of this? First and foremost, informed consent. And that, thus far, internet giants have been very poor at doing. Even small little businesses have been fairly poor at doing. Consent, or informed consent, is presumed, and it is presumed that we read the terms and conditions that nobody of us ever reads. We just press next. So this is quite problematic, and it is something certainly that GDPR has gone some way towards remedying. But aside from the legal requirements, is incredibly important ethically from the perspective of a business in order to avoid any kind of backlash by potential customers, but also from governments. Another question is around who owns this data. As Matt's highlighted, a lot of places in the world are starting to discuss new ways of tying data to individuals, and so to draw clearer boundaries around us actually owning our own data. As it stands today, anything that you upload onto a social media giant or put out on your blog isn't necessarily owned by you. And that means that, some legal exceptions aside, you don't really have a right to say, take this down, get rid of this, because it is controlled by someone else. And it also means that they can repackage it and sell it on to third parties because it's theirs, not yours. That is fairly problematic. As I highlighted, talking a mile a minute, as I highlighted, another important thing is the decontextualization of this data. A lot of statisticians and people who are data evangelists argue that the more data you have, the less important it becomes that you have context for this data. But a lot of statistical studies have actually shown that context can give a lot of value to what it is that the data is actually describing, and perhaps in many cases can actually contradict what seems to be a pattern that the data is describing. As I mentioned earlier, third-party services, which are essentially, the little add-ons to what we think about our data being used for, are incredibly problematic because not only are they not the people that we initially entrust our data with, but they have even more data than the people we initially entrusted it with. So you could end up with even larger bundles, but also your data being sold off to people and to companies and to governments that you don't want to have access to your data. And so for us here in Sweden, we don't think so much about the Swedish government and whether it's problematic that they have our data. We just, use our push number and our credit cards happily. But of course, in many regimes around the world, for them to be able to have that kind of oversight over you can be problematic. I remember reading a paper not so long ago in one non-democratic regime that used credit card data to identify who had been taking part in a pro-democracy protest, and based on that could then identify individuals and arrest them. So this is very problematic, and these are global problems, not just Swedish problems. And so the age-old in the digital age adage still applies. If you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product. And this is a note of caution, perhaps, when it comes to data. Most of the rest of this book is very positive towards FinTech. And for 90% of services, I agree 100%. There are new markets, there are new services, there is a lot of efficiency gain to be made by using data. But as this continues and as this moves forward, we need to be responsible in this use of data in order to make sure that it's sustainable and doesn't run away. And enforcement of this and concerns around this have already started to manifest in ways that we didn't or weren't fully aware of when I originally wrote this book chapter. And I think maybe I'll do these recommendations you can discuss further later. But one of the major top-down concerns has already come from the European Commission, that they are looking to regulate large data-gathering companies, i.e. the tech titans. And so that is something to think about, that there is some top-down pressure, but that maybe we as grassroots individuals have some role to play. And I think Mats summarized it really nicely when he said that perhaps some of these distributed ways of taking control of our own data, wherever it may lie on the internet, is a good way to go forward. And so based on the blockchain, perhaps based on some other kinds of technology, already people are starting to develop grassroots level services that allow us to take back control of identifying information of ourselves on the internet. And it's not perfect yet. There are a lot of glitches and a lot of teething problems, but it certainly flags the concerns that consumers are starting to have about the way in which their data is being used. And as consumers ourselves, but also I'm guessing there are a lot of people who run businesses, the fact that there are both top-down pushes and grassroots concerns in this area would maybe make us think again and maybe think about some of these recommendations as we develop our FinTech services going forward. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Yeah, nice to be here.
Okay, you can stay up on the stage because we want all the speakers. Now we're going to have questions. And I think we have one more author on the stage as well.
Mats?
Yes.
Mats, yes, and Åke.
And Robin, yeah. And we have two additional speakers from the book sitting in the front. So if you've read the book, feel free to specify your questions to Mikael or Åke, who are sitting in the front row. We have around 15 to 20 minutes for questions, so please keep yourself concise and we can get as many questions in as possible. So yeah, we'll open up the floor. We have someone there in the back.
Yes, I will run with the microphone.
Thank you. Just a question that is a bit provocative. What is actually FinTech? For example, Amazon or even Facebook, are they FinTech companies or are they not? And if not, what is the difference? This kind of thing. Thank you.
It's very fuzzy, is the short answer. what seems to be the case is that companies self-identify as fintech, but also the short and sweet definition is technology companies that operate in areas that are traditionally only finance or provide financial services. And so, yeah, it comes with unclear boundaries, and it is very tricky. And perhaps this is also why none of us are making sweeping statements about fintech, because there is so much heterogeneity. But it's a very good question. Short and sweet, tech in finance, I don't know more than that.
Actually, I'd like to ask Michal to say something, because he published a report recently exactly looking at the blurry lines of fintech, and he also writes about this in the book. So I think he's the perfect person to answer this question.
Or at least I give my best to zoom in and say, give you a research answer, but it depends. So I think the only way that we realize how to move forward was to cluster fintech a little bit. So then we decided, at least in this chapter, to introduce a term what is called primary fintech. So primary fintech, they are all of the services that we're used to that banks are offering. So the banks are offering insurance, lending, payments, etc. This is what we have clustered as primary fintech. And things started to be a little bit more fuzzy, as Robin said afterwards. I remember when we have been spotting clustering those fintech companies on a circle, then I came across a website, and then they said that they are one of the biggest Swedish fintech companies. And when I zoomed in what they really do, they were printing debit and credit cards. So I was like, okay, they are not fintech, they are printing houses. So it's a kind of a very hip to be a part of fintech. So as mentioned, we're primarily secondary fintech, and because of that, once you read those different reports and plenty of consultancy reports, this is actually how the chapter clarifying the blurry lines of fintech started. Once we reviewed those chapters, we realized that all of the data is not adding up in terms of investment sizes, in terms of employees, because as everybody has a different definition of fintech, it was nearly impossible to have a direction how fintech is developing, in a short version at least.
Do we have any more questions?
Everything was all crystal clear.
Yeah.
There's an arm there. He's still thinking about it.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
So we've heard three different perspectives on what the future for fintech would ideally have. So a lot of collaboration, the capability of building trust, and a responsible data policy. But I'm curious, in between that, like between you three, when you speak with each other, what excites you the most? And don't say blockchain, please.
That's a great question. I think one of the things that excites me is trying to understand these bottom-up collectives and how are they self-organizing and enabling transactions among themselves of value where perhaps money is not involved, whether it's a barter, a credit system, or something else, and how that can actually has the potential to very much influence the way we think about nation states and how we think about governments and how they're monitoring and enabling monetary flows, et cetera, taxation. I think this is where if we go further, like do we need money? What will money look like in 20 years or financial transactions? And as a government, say, as Sweden, where yes, we have a very nice, stable central bank, we have a nice tax system, we have all these wonderful digital welfare services. What will happen in the future? How are these new potential solutions coming along going to challenge what we take as granted? So that's actually what really excites me, as you can see. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm with her, but something that I would add is it highlights how power and power structures can be kind of paradoxical, right? We think governments have power, we think firms have power, but for example, you look at data without all of the individuals involved, so us, about whom they collect data, they wouldn't have businesses. And so that gives us a huge amount of power. And when we rally and organize, we can create different kinds of systems. We can create different kinds of businesses. We can create value in a different way. And I think, I mean, the blockchain is maybe just an interesting example of that, but is a highlight of a bigger theme.
Yeah, I would like to add, I agree with you both. Specifically what you told us in the beginning, Robin, that you have to challenge your assumptions. I think what excites me generally is the general picture, talking about all these things. My first kind of focus idea is that technology is what changes the world. Innovations like the wheel, the printing press, and now the internet. And if you take that all the way from human history, you know. And there is so much going on right now in the world, and so many innovations change the conditions for just everything. We can't stop that. It's accelerating, but what we can do is shaping it. So what excites me is this discussion about how can we investigate, understand this, challenge assumptions, see what we can do. It's a political discussion in the end, because we have to have ideas what we want to achieve and how we can fight visions that we don't share. And fight for things that we think would be good for humanity and for society. And there are so many open possibilities in that. I think that's exciting.
Cool. We have one question over here.
Thank you. My name is Robert, and I studied at the Stockholm School of Economics some decades ago, and I'm very happy to see you all here. I'm a part owner of a consumer credit company, and I'm just was astounded by looking at the Wonga way of collecting credit information, and I sincerely think that if you could predict the behavior of the consumers, then there would, well, possibly be no credit losses at all. So if possible, could you dwell a little upon how could you collect information, trace information, so to speak, in more ways to get, well, even better credit decisions. It's in my own interest, of course, but since no one else was posing any questions, I thought I'd just take the opportunity. Thank you.
You're the trace person, but I think I mean, if I think about it, it's about where. I mean, there's a large ethical question embedded in that as well. But I think, to me, it's where are people active? I heard of one company that was looking at being able to detect people developing Alzheimer's by the way they were logging on to the bank, online banking. So were they entering a wrong date or taking longer to actually enter the data? And through this patterns, they're following, an individual and patterns, as well as then analyzing other patterns, saying, okay, if people this, okay, then that looks like that they're developing Alzheimer's. So I think it's about where are people acting and what are they doing, but thinking differently. How can we understand? Not necessarily. Maybe it doesn't have to do with looking for the how they're using or their credit card. Maybe it's something completely different. I mean, it's like Claire was mentioning. It's like if they come in with a premium iPad versus some cheap Android device. That's then they know. Okay, what type of perhaps economic background does this individual have? So I think it's a little bit about not thinking. I mean, thinking. I don't like to say outside the box, but thinking with no box. Thinking, different where people behave, what behaviors going on, but then how can we combine that with other data as well? So
I can add to that another, again, possibly problematic set of data that is being collected is around social networks. And so what's happening is we typically think of credit worthiness as being an individual level decision, but of course we're all embedded in social structures. And so one credit institution that I know of collects individual level credit data for individuals who are linked to one another in social networks, and they can see if, let's say, you're someone who has a good credit score and you're surrounded in a social network by people with rubbish credit scores, that negatively impacts your credit score. So yeah, I mean, we can have a whole long conversation. It's a very long shopping list of some less problematic than others, but a lot of them are very problematic. I think I'm biased. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Angelica, and I would like to be on the question of trust. So if you would talk about of a FinTech building trust to replace what the other institutions and bank have a kind of place today, what would you say about how would they build trust?
Basically, I tried to add this in before, but the thing is, as I said before, you can build trust with markers, you can build it with social networking and etc. But I think the interesting thing here is, I think it's interesting to see the combination of what you were talking about, collecting data, because if you take it into perspective about trustworthiness, we could take the parallel of the situation in China now, where what you said started as a FinTech company doing credit scoring is being developed by the regime in China to build not only a credit score, but a trust score for each citizen of China, a compulsory trust score, which is, by the way, is the same way as you described, influenced by the people around you, your friends. So this will influence the way, the possibilities you have in society to have not only loans, but doing travels or getting a work or going, have your kids in school, or everything. And that could be influenced by the friends you have. So you should unfriend that person. You don't know the trust score of that person, though, but you could guess. So you should unfriend that person because it lowers your trust score. I mean, it's here. It's so much, not so much about how to build trust, but how you use, who is doing it, and how it's being used. If it's transparent or not, if you can control it or not, if it can be misused or not. So it's not a question. With digital methods, you can create trust, you can build trust with markers, you can analyze and calculate trust in people and in companies. But it depends very much how you want to use it and who is doing it. I don't know if that was an answer to your question.
But I just to add on to that, I think that trust is really becoming an increasingly complex concept as we move into this digital world. Because on the one hand, you have to, as a consumer, I have to be able to trust the product. It's going to work the way that they say it will. It's not fraudulent, or et cetera. But I also have to trust the network of other individuals using this. Do I trust the other people in the network as well? Especially if you're thinking about third party, or where you're acting as a real platform business model, where you're connecting people, say through crowdfunding, so people bringing, supplying money to those who are interested in finding money. Can I trust those who are actually supplying, or the ones, actually borrowing my money through this platform? So you not only have the product, but the others in the network. But then you also have to think about, okay, how do we ensure trust in terms of cybersecurity, hacking, making sure that my data, that if I am buying all this data as a company, that it won't get hacked. Also about we've talked about the privacy, the integrity of how you use the data. But I think there's also the regulation, the compliance. Do you fulfill regulation and compliance? All these different areas, if you mess up, then it spreads like rings through the water. And I think this is only becoming increasingly more complex as you've got all these different levels of actually having to think about, where you need to build trust. And one of the things that many people talk about in this new economy is it's not the first mover advantage, but it's your first to scale advantage. Because that's when you start creating network effects and creating this sustainable competitive advantage, barriers to entry, et cetera. But you can't scale unless you have trust, and you've managed to develop trust at all these different facets of it. So, yeah.
Magnus, do we have any questions in the back? No? Okay, we have two in the front.
Hi, I have a question related to data. How do you see the biggest change that the GDPR will do to FinTech companies and other companies related to the data, the big data that they collect?
I suspect one of the biggest changes is that particularly FinTech companies don't have the competence to do GDPR in-house, and so they will move it aside and have it in a third-party service. And that's great for that FinTech because they don't have direct liability. But for us as consumers, there are, and I discussed some of them in this chapter. I mean, third-party services could have their servers in any number of places. There are suddenly a whole lot more data sitting on third-party services as a consequence. I think that's one of the negative side effects. One of the positive side effects is that the bar internationally has been set very, very high in terms of the informed consent that is required, but also in terms of the transparency that companies need to have when working with our data. And by far, GDPR sets the bar much higher than anywhere else in the world.
Do we have time for one more? One more? Yeah. Vem var först? Var det du eller? Jag tror det var som var först där.
Thank you. I know a lot of us have been, when we talk about FinTech or when we talk about data, we're always talking about companies having responsibilities. But like you said, if you don't pay for a service, you are the product, you're not the customer. But that understanding, what is our responsibility as persons sharing the data, towards understanding that this is our data and how it used impacts us, because I come from a payment or service background, and 50 to 60% of the online fraud is actually social engineering, someone leaving their password through a link. And that is the thing, like if you're sharing your data, what is your responsibility as a person? Do you have a insight on that? Thank you.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think, sorry, I've gone and fiddled with this. I think that individuals should be more aware of how it is that they use their data. Unfortunately, the reality is that they're not. And so then it becomes really tricky. Does that mean that because they don't know and they don't understand, that too bad for them? I don't really like that solution, and I think that that's why the burden is so often moved to companies, because the expectation is that they know better, but also that it's easier for authorities and other people who have some interest in consumer well-being to oversee companies than it is for them to oversee consumers. So I do agree with you 100%. If everybody was knowledgeable, I would love a situation where we could all be responsible for our own data, but not everybody is by a long shot. But great question. Thank you.
I think there is a fine line here which is interesting. It's about the situation that you mentioned where you can actually be responsible for something that you know about, and you go a little bit on the side with the situation that you're talking about with the loaning company here, where you're nudged without actually being aware of it. And if we go further away, you see the Cambridge Analytica situation where you're being nudged without even being there, so you're being influenced down by data that influences you. And the problem here, unfortunately, is that we are humans and we are very easily to manipulate. Now, this is an issue, and that's nothing we can do about because we are like that. And I see it as a main problem in the future because we're going to be so easy to manipulate by systems, by artificial intelligence systems, or by regimes that want to do this. So how do we handle that? Because we're not even aware of it, of being manipulable. And I think that's an issue that we have to be aware of. And because if you want to resist to something, you need to first you need to be aware of it, and then if you're aware of it, you need to be interested about gathering information and understanding it. So it's a difficult situation, actually.
Can we have one more, or?
I think we have to stop now because the time is running. So you had some closing remarks, you and Anthony. So please enter the stage.
So it was great seeing everyone here. We don't have that much time, unfortunately, left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with the link to the book download, where you can download it for your Kindle, your PDF, or you can also purchase the book if you have money. And with that, I will also leave over to Anthony, who's my colleague, who's going to describe the next project we're working on.
So thank you very much, and very excited to see so many of you here today. We really put a lot of heart and soul into this project, and a big thank you to all the authors and all the contributors, and for all the people funding and backing this project, and also for Estrad for having us here today. So there's a lot of talk today about digitalization, and moving forward, where do we go from here? What's the next step? Undoubtedly, it's a subject that affects everyone. Some are Some are scared by it, some are excited by it, some are completely indifferent, but it affects everyone. So imagine a scenario where the future becomes more and more digitalized. Every service that you do, any welfare service, effectively becomes digitalized. What happens then if it reaches its extremist point? What role will the state play? Will it be taken over by other non-governmental actors providing services that can meet the demands of the public and the accessibility that the public demands? Or will the state try and put up a fight and try and claim its territory? These are questions we're exploring right now in our next book, with Robin and I are heading. And we are currently putting a sequel, if you will, a follow-up to this current project, where we will explore all of these subjects. So, given the timeline for this book, it took about a year, isn't it? Yeah. So I hope to be holding a lecture on this topic. Well, hopefully quicker than a year, but. So I hope to see as many of you as possible back here again. But with those closing remarks, I'd like to thank everyone, and I'd like to thank everyone for being here once again, and thank all the presenters for a wonderful, magnificent presentation. Please free to ask us any questions that you want after the presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have small gifts for you, but I saw that Robin had to leave. But you can give them afterwards. We support UNICEF School in the Box, another way to disseminate knowledge. And we have a small bowl, recycled glass for the Easter candy. So thank you so much. I also want to thank our main partners, Tillväxtverket and Vinnova, and our partner, Länsstyrelsen in Stockholm. Thanks to their support, we can arrange Estrad free of cost for you. And also, check your inbox. We'll soon sending out new invitations. Thank you so much. I will.